So I want to talk about the notion that consciousness can exist outside of the brain. And this sounds kind of crazy, this notion, thinking about what is consciousness and the fact that it might be more complicated than we think. Typically, thinking of consciousness as something that exists outside the brain, that's something that could, envelop as like a fog that could expand from a region through a segment of space, is something that sounds pretty foolish or sounds unscientific or difficult to understand. But there's a lot of legitimate scientists who start to have these sort of hypotheses and theories about consciousness that can get pretty interesting and unexpected. And I want to highlight this one here, this book, The Consciousness Instinct by Michael Gazzaniga. Because I was reading that, and a lot of that got me thinking about these sort of questions. So thinking first about the brain. When we think about the brain, we think about this mass of neural tissue that's inside our skull. It's protected by our skull. Clearly, this is a special piece of neural tissue because we have our own helmet surrounding it and protecting it. But this piece of neural tissue has extended itself beyond the skull. So a lot of times, thinking of the brain as what we typically think of as the brain, which is what sits inside our skull, is not the complete picture. The complete picture is actually the notion that the brain extends itself from the skull throughout the entire body. Of course, that's, the peripheral nervous system. There's the distinctions between the central and the peripheral nervous system and the notion of the brain. And that they're kind of separate based on the language that we use, but really we need all of that. The brain has to send out neurons throughout the entire body to sense, touch, to feel. It sends out a bunch of them, and we have our eyes and our ears. So all of these senses basically reflect the fact that it's super important for the brain to reach out and understand what's going on in the world. And the fact that we have these senses that allow us to understand and that construct a world for us in terms of the colors that we see and our notion of how we exist in physical space, the notion that pain appears to correspond to, say, a point on your finger, when there's no pain that exists in a specific location on your body. The feeling that you have that it exists in a location on your body is constructed by the brain. So all of this happens by the brain making a story about the world that makes sense to us and that helps us navigate the world. Because ultimately you can argue that the primary function of the brain is to move about in the world. So the very beginning neural tissues that animals develop, usually they're important and they come about because that animal is going to begin moving. So one side of that little cell becomes the face, the side that approaches the environment first, and that becomes the face, and then the other side becomes, the back end of the organism. And the neurons go towards the face where they can experience the world firsthand and interact with it. So the notion that the brain is so important for exploring the world is depicted by this notion of the sea squirt, which actually is usually sedentary on the ocean, and it's attached where it just does its sea squirt thing. But it has a phase in its lifestyle where it has to travel. And so it has, I'm going to say like limited neural tissue when it's stationary, but when it has to travel, it develops this neural tissue that's more complicated that allows it to travel. And then once it reaches its next point and it's fixated there, that phase of its life is over, and it actually basically eats its brain. It eats the neural tissue that allowed it to travel, or it reabsorbs it, It's not going to keep it around if it doesn't need it. And so the intention there is that it only needed it because it had to move. So the function of the brain is super important in terms of movement in the environment. Now, thinking about what consciousness means. Consciousness is the subjective feeling of an experience. It's like an awareness. It's been called an instinct and a collection of attention and memories. It's kind of difficult to describe, but I think it's something that everybody can kind of intuitively try to understand. But think of consciousness as the attention that you can bring towards that object. And appreciating the notion that the brain is nothing inside the skull by itself. It depends on these sensors that reach out from the skull to our sensory organs that pull in information from the environment and construct a story about that information. Well, all those stories that it creates are fundamental to this creation of consciousness that we have, the notion of our own experience. So the fact that you're able to choose some visual object and fixate on it and have a perception of that object means that the consciousness that exists inside has extended through space to that object. So basically, I'm making the argument that anything that you can perceive, any construction of your local environment that you can process, is how far your consciousness extends. And the reason for that is because your neural tissues have the capability of constructing that environment. The fact that the brain extends from the skull to the outside world to actually capture light and to capture sensation means that consciousness itself also extends to the outside world. So, we have this tendency to think that things should, we have a deterministic sort of culture that's been a part of the human culture from philosophy, is that things are deterministic. And we also have this desire to make it so that we perceive that we can control things. So when we discovered the fundamental ingredients of what plants need, NPK, we thought that we could just, package it and you could just sprinkle this stuff all on the soil and we could have a bunch of plants. But it turns out it's not quite as simple as that. And actually, understanding the complexity of the process of the earth is a more long-term, sustaining, healthier option than trying to think we can control how plants behave and then only give those 3 molecules. Another example is when we figured out what was in breast milk, we thought that we could only give that and to kids and that it would be the same. But we just can't replicate breast milk because there's just a complexity of something that's in it, everything that's in it, how it gives immunity and a lot of factors that we just can't replicate. But we have this desire to want to control something. We'd almost rather this feeling of control than the notion that we don't have control, because it creates uncertainty and it can be difficult. So when we think about the brain as a society, when we think about the notion that as a society, we're deterministic, we try to wrap our control over things as humans and take possession of things, well, that perspective is manifested in the way that we analyze and think about the brain. So if you think about the brain as existing purely inside the skull, and you don't appreciate the fact that it extends throughout the body, and the notion that your unconscious experience incorporates the body, then it's potentially an unhealthy way of looking at the world. And it's the standard way of looking at the world. There's more ancient ways of looking at the world and thinking about our thoughts. Buddhist tradition, for example, that actually incorporates the body. And, we're familiar with the head and the heart notion. Why do you think that we talk about the heart so much? Why do we think that the heart has meaning when we discuss it? Well, it could be that there's some reason why imagining the heart as a source of information actually has some wisdom. If it's a story that's been handed down for hundreds or thousands of years, then it's possible that there's some wisdom in that. And so if you think about energy as moving throughout the body, then you can potentially, which is a big part of sort of some ancient wisdoms, is thinking about feeling the energy throughout the body and the chakras and all this stuff. There's probably a reason why some of these stories have persisted for so long. Now, if you think about today's culture, that the notion of the energy throughout the body, the notion of consciousness extending from the body, is not prevalent. It's not common. But what is common is thinking that it all resides within this single fixated focal point of the brain. And often, in the neurosciences, there's this desire to pinpoint a specific location, the seat of consciousness, for example. And to think about consciousness as having a seat, as if there's a little location in the brain that is responsible for it, when we know the complexity of the entire central and peripheral nervous system and contributing to our experience, that could be a perception that is not healthy in terms of guiding our views on the world and ourselves as humans. And this is generally what scientific studies have shown. So this is the Gazzaniga in his split brain patients. We have two hemispheres of the brain, and they're connected by the corpus callosum. And you would think that if you severed the relationship between the two hemispheres, it would be chaos. It would be a huge detriment to people's experiences. And, if you saw somebody who had the two hemispheres split by severing the corpus callosum, you would think that their behavior would be noticeably different. But it isn't really. And they effectively operate as if they have sort of two consciousnesses. So the fundamental unit of consciousness, according to this, is not the brain. It means that it's one half of the brain. But you can even divide it up even further. So if you lose the outer layer of the brain, then consciousness can still exist. So there are many sort of ways that the brain can be degraded, even including throughout old age, where people still have a form of consciousness. It's very hard to remove consciousness. And the notion is that it's more complicated, it's more distributed, it's more complex than having a single location. And it can exist within something that's smaller than a single intact brain. And they go so far, there's scientific researchers out there who go so far as to say that consciousness might exist in a molecular level. If there's a sort of molecular complexity of biological molecules, those molecules might have something that resembles consciousness. And that's the sort of thing that got me thinking, okay, I was floating in a lake and I was just looking up at the clouds, and granted I was high, and I was thinking, if my perception extends out to the clouds, and I was thinking about my feeling of consciousness, thinking about seeing these clouds out there, where is the space of consciousness? Does it actually extend from me to those clouds all the way out there by virtue of the fact that the brain has extended itself from me to the clouds by connecting to a sensory apparatus that can visually see clouds and construct a perception for me of what it means to see them and experience clouds? It means that effectively consciousness is extending that far. And I think that there's something beneficial about thinking that that's something more complicated than a simple deterministic answer, a simple seat of consciousness. It might not be correct what I'm saying, but I think there's wisdom in the perspective of it. Just like the notion that something comes from the heart is most likely not correct, but there's something intuitive. There's somewhere you could go in your head when you allow yourself to go there that is advantageous. And that's why throughout such a long human history, we've developed these stories about thinking from the heart and the head, thinking from, the chakras and things like that. So I hope this made some sense. And you could hit that subscribe and the bell button to keep up with my posts. I post every Sunday, typically about music, but sometimes psychology and stuff like that. So thanks for checking this out. Hit the like if you like this. Hit the share if you want to share. And I'll see you later.